let's talk about Juju Smith Schuster. He is being left for dead. And in a lot of ways, he's not a sexy pick this year. He's falling into that Jarvis Landry, that Tyler Boyd range where it's just these like guys that you kind of know in your heart of hearts, like they're probably going to be solid for the year, but they just don't have any sex appeal. They don't have any upside that makes you want to rush out and draft these guys. And that's why he's going back to the 7th round for Juju Smith Schuster, wide receiver 38 per Underdog Fantasy's ADP. That's half point PPR. So, Alex, how do you feel about this ADP? It feels pretty ridiculous.
I literally just had to go into Underdog and validate that ADP, wide receiver 38, and it's right. And it's egregious to me. Like, what are we doing? Why is Juju wide receiver 38? This makes absolutely no sense to me. People act like he sucked last year for fantasy football. He was the wide receiver 16 in full PPR. He was a high-end wide receiver 2 for the full season, and for some reason, he's trash now. It just makes absolutely no sense. He's an absolute steal in drafts in the back of the 7th round, and he's being valued at his absolute floor. He posted 128 targets in 2020. He should be a lock for another 120 plus targets in 2021, even with Chase Claypool continuing to emerge. And I think it's this whole narrative about like the way the Steelers ended the season. Big Ben and his noodle arm can't push the ball down the field. But honestly, I think that could work out in Juju's favor in these PPR formats, because average depth of target is something we look at for quarterbacks and for these wide receivers. And typically, if you're a wide receiver, you want a high average depth of target. Every target you get, you want to be able to maximize the yards that you're getting. You want to be able to get those receptions downfield that can turn into these big plays and these touchdowns. In 2020, Big Ben's average depth of target was 6.9 yards. Ugh. That's very, very low. Juju Smith Schuster's average depth of target was 5.5 yards, which is honestly terrible if we're looking at that metric on its own. But you look at Deontay Johnson, who is at 7.9 average depth of target. You look at Claypool, who is at 13.2 average depth of target. And you look at Juju at 5.5. And when I connect Big Ben's low ADOT and Juju's low ADOT, I'm saying, well, this kind of lines up, because if Big Ben's struggling to push it down the field, if he's wanting to throw underneath to the slot, these little checkdowns, Juju Smith-Schuster could absolutely eat in the slot. He could absolutely eat on these underneath routes, because if Big Ben's not looking to push it downfield or can't push it downfield or doesn't have confidence to push it downfield, he's just going to keep checking down underneath to Juju, who's going to be wide open all day, because you have these threats in Deontay Johnson and Chase Claypool on the outside. So I think in a weird way that could actually lead to Juju's volume being much, much higher than we expect in 2021. And Smith-Schuster also possesses touchdown upside. We don't think of him as one of these big-bodied red zone threats, but in 3 full seasons that he's played with Big Ben, he's posted 7 or more touchdowns in each of those seasons, because he just has crafty ways to get open near the goal line. And he and Big Ben do have a really, really strong rapport and really, really good connection. So I think 85 plus receptions, 850 plus yards, and 5 touchdowns is like an absolute floor baseline for Juju in 2021. And that puts him right in that wide receiver 2 range for these PPR formats. That's a significant return on value from his current ADP. I'll admit, with Juju, you're probably not getting that top 10 upside this season. You're not getting really that wide receiver 1 upside. But in the back of the 7th round, at the wide receiver 38 right now, if you do start off your draft with 3 good running backs in those first 4 or 5 rounds like we recommend, you come back and you get a couple of stud wide receivers as well, and you can snag Juju as a guy that's your wide receiver 3 or your flex. That is a perfect floor play for your PPR roster, and I just honestly can't believe that ADP is where it is. I really hope, for just the sake of all that is right, that his ADP does rise as we get closer to the season. But if it doesn't, I'm just going to keep snagging that value all day long.
You have a guy who's on an offense that's been, when Big Ben's been driving the van, he's been number 1 or number 2 in pass attempts per game. So we're talking about an offense that, if all remains constant, assuming his elbow doesn't just totally fall off his body and it's Dwayne Haskins taking over for the season, this should be a very voluminous offense. I know their defense is good. Doesn't matter. We saw their defense crumble towards the end of last year. And they were still number 2 in team pass plays per game last year with the stud defense. Now, you have Najee Harris coming in. Will probably help the running game. I think we can all project that, though the offensive line didn't get too much better. And I think people are fading Juju because they're excited about Chase Claypool. Mm-hmm. And Deontay Johnson's kind of like fully broken out to what now where people like him a lot. So I think people say, oh, the number 3 on an offense that's not pushing the ball downfield, he might be the number 3 in the passing game, but even at his target share last year, 19.6% target share, it was number 41st in the NFL. His target share sucks, but there's just so much volume that he was able to finish 15th in targets last year, 8 targets per game.
Exactly.
And to your point, what area of the field are we certainly not going to push the ball deep? It's going to be in the red zone because you got to get in that end zone. You are back against the wall essentially as far as your play calling. Juju Smith Schuster last year was 4th in the NFL in red zone targets. So we're talking about a guy that's relied upon for high value touches. Do we expect him to be a yardage monster? No, because he's going to have that low average at the target, but he's going to get a ton of receptions. And he was 13th last year in yards after the catch. I still think Juju is very good as a football player. I think he can make big plays. He's shown that he's explosive every year leading up to this. Maybe last year we could discount some of that due to injury, but he still had some breakaway plays, even without big men on a terrible offense. And before he even really took over as the number 2 or de facto number 1 post Antonio Brown for the Steelers, he was a special teams monster. Like, Juju is a good football player. I think people are going way too far. Yes, he's not the sexy pick. Yes, the offense caps his ceiling. And even if Najee Harris does take away some of the low depth of target pass catching, it should open up more for Juju to just soak up all these targets, have more room to make plays after the catch. And I expect him to still get those red zone and those end zone looks. So I'm with you. He's a floor play. That's why he's not sexy. But he's certainly a guy who can fill in your wide receiver 3, your flex on any given week. He's a guy I'd love to have just sitting there on my bench as just a old reliable to plug in my lineup.